I was standing in the Family Search Center on a Wednesday afternoon when I found the document that would unravel 25 years of faith. The fluorescent lights hummed above me, the same lights that had witnessed thousands of hours of my work connecting families across generations. My water bottle sat forgotten beside my keyboard, the one I always brought from home because the drinking fountain down the hall had that metallic taste. And there, on my screen, was a baptism record from 1952 that didn't make sense. The Williams family, converted in Georgia, mother, father, 3 children, all baptized on the same spring day. I could picture it. The white clothing, the nervous excitement, the promises of forever. But as I scrolled through the subsequent records, looking for what should have come next, I found nothing. No endowment dates, no sealing records, no temple work at all. In 25 years of genealogical research, I had seen thousands of convert families. The pattern was always the same. Baptism, then temple preparation, then the sacred ordinances that would bind them for eternity. But the Williams family had stopped at baptism. For 26 years until 1978, there was nothing. My name is Maggie Sorensen. I'm 58 years old, and I have spent more than half my life in this building, in rooms just like this one, helping people find their ancestors. I truly believed, that this was sacred work, that every name I found, every connection I made, was another soul waiting to receive the gospel on the other side of the veil. I used to cry when I found missing links. I used to feel the Spirit so strongly that my hands would shake. That Wednesday, my hands were shaking for a different reason. This story is inspired by real testimonies, but the characters and locations are fictional. I've changed details to protect real people. The facts about church history and doctrine? Those are documented. Sources are linked below. Let me tell you about Darren Williams. He walked into my office 3 weeks before that Wednesday, a tall man in his early 60s with graying temples and a warm handshake. He wasn't a member of the church. He made that clear right away, settling into the chair across from my desk with a paper cup from the Starbucks down the street. The smell of coffee drifted across my desk, bitter and foreign. I hadn't been around that smell much since my mission in England 30 years ago. When investigators would offer me cups, I had to politely decline. His grandmother had been a member, he said. She'd converted back in the 50s, somewhere in Georgia, and he wanted to know more about that side of his family. She never talked about it much, he told me. But when she passed last year, I found her journal. She wrote about the church constantly, about how much it meant to her, about wanting her family to be together forever. He pulled out a worn leather journal, and I felt that familiar flutter in my chest. This was why I did this work. This was the sacred part. I want to know if she got what she wanted, Darren said. I want to know if she made it to the temple. I took the journal carefully, reverently. Let me see what I can find. I had no idea what I was about to find. The first few days of research were routine. I traced Darren's grandmother, Eloise Williams, back through census records and vital statistics. Born in 1918, married to Thomas Williams in 1940, 3 children, Thomas Jr., Mary, and little Samuel. They moved from Alabama to Georgia in 1948, following work. And then, in 1952, they found the missionaries. I found the baptism records easily. March 15th, 1952. All 5 of them baptized in a river outside of Macon because the nearest chapel didn't have a font. I smiled at my screen, imagining the scene. The commitment it must have taken. The faith. The missionaries probably wore their short-sleeved white shirts and ties even in the Georgia heat, standing in that muddy water, welcoming a family into what they promised was the true Church of Jesus Christ. Then I started looking for what came next. The temple records for that era are meticulous. I've spent countless hours in them, finding endowments and sealings for families just like the Williams. The church kept careful track of who received which ordinances and when. So when I searched for Eloise Williams and found nothing, I assumed I'd made an error. I checked the spelling. I checked alternate databases. I checked the records of the nearest temples. Atlanta didn't have one until much later, so they would have traveled to the Washington, D.C. temple or maybe Arizona. Families saved for years to make those trips. They planned them like pilgrimages, piling into station wagons with coolers full of sandwiches and lemonade, driving for days to reach those sacred buildings. I searched every possible location. Nothing. 26 years of membership, and Eloise Williams never went to the temple. That was strange, but it wasn't unheard of. Sometimes converts fell away. Sometimes life got in the way. Sometimes people just never made the trip. I made a note to look into it further and moved on to the next generation. That's when I noticed the pattern. Thomas Williams Jr., baptized at age 12 in 1952, no temple records. Mary Williams, baptized at age 10, no temple records. Samuel Williams, baptized at age 7, no temple records. All 3 children grew up, got married, had children of their own, and none of them, not a single one, had any temple ordinances recorded until after 1978. Then suddenly, in 1979, there was an explosion of activity. Endowments, sealings, everything the family had been waiting for, all at once, 26 years after their baptism. I stared at my screen for a long time. Something had happened in 1978. I knew in the vague way that long-term members know things, that there had been some kind of policy change around that time. Something about the priesthood. But I'd never looked into the details. I'd never had reason to. The families I usually researched were pioneer stock, descended from the saints who had crossed the plains with Brigham Young, whose names were etched into monuments at This Is the Place Heritage Park. The patterns I was used to seeing didn't have this strange 26-year gap. I typed 3 words into the database that night. What came back would keep me awake for months. Priesthood ban history. The search returned hundreds of results, documents, talks, essays, official church publications and academic analyses and personal testimonies. I clicked on the first link, a gospel topics essay on the church's own website, and I started to read. The essay was careful, measured. It used phrases like disavows the theories, and we do not know precisely why. But underneath the careful language, the facts were clear. For over a century, Black members of the church had been denied the priesthood. Black men couldn't hold any priesthood office, not deacon, not teacher, not priest, not elder. They couldn't pass the sacrament or bless it. They couldn't baptize their own children or give them father's blessings when they were sick. Black women couldn't receive temple ordinances. Black families couldn't be sealed for eternity. From some point in Brigham Young's presidency until 1978, an entire race of people had been excluded from the highest blessings of the gospel. I read it 3 times. Then I read it again. This couldn't be right. I had been a member my entire life, born in the covenant, as we say, to parents who had been sealed in the temple before I was born. I had attended primary singing I Am a Child of God and Follow the Prophet with the other children. I had graduated from seminary at 6 a.m. every school day for 4 years, bleary-eyed but faithful, studying the scriptures before the sun came up. I had served a mission in England, knocking on doors in the rain, testifying of the restoration. I had sat through thousands of hours of sacrament meetings, Sunday school classes, Relief Society lessons. How had I never heard this? But even as I asked the question, I knew the answer. I had heard it. Somewhere. Sometime. Someone had mentioned it in passing. Things were different back then. The Lord reveals things in His own time. We don't focus on the past. I had absorbed these deflections without ever stopping to ask what they were deflecting from. I scrolled through the essay, looking for details, and there it was, in black and white, the justification. Church leaders had taught that Black people bore the curse of Cain, that they had been less valiant in the pre-existence. That great war in heaven we learned about in Sunday school, where some spirits chose to follow Jesus and others followed Lucifer. According to these teachings, Black people had been fence-sitters, not valiant enough in that pre-mortal life, and their dark skin and mortality was a mark of that divine disfavor. These weren't fringe beliefs from random members. These were doctrines taught by prophets, by apostles, by the men I had been taught to sustain as God's mouthpieces on earth. I closed my laptop at 2 a.m. My husband, Gerald, had long since gone to bed, probably after his usual evening routine of scripture study and prayer. I sat in the dark of my home office, surrounded by the genealogical charts and family group sheets I had accumulated over decades. The walls were covered with them, my own pioneer ancestors, the families I'd helped research, the intricate web of eternal connections I had spent my life mapping, and I tried to make sense of what I had learned. Eloise Williams had converted in 1952. She had believed in eternal families. She had written about it in her journal, the journal her grandson had brought me, the one sitting on my desk. She had kept the word of wisdom faithfully, giving up the sweet iced tea that was a staple of Georgia life, never touching the coffee her neighbors drank each morning. She had paid tithing from their meager income. She had kept the Sabbath day holy, attending church in her best dress every Sunday. She had wanted that promise, that sealing, that forever. And the church had told her no. Not because she was unworthy, not because she had sinned, not because she lacked faith, but because of the color of her skin. I thought about Darren's question. I want to know if she got what she wanted. Now I knew the answer. For 26 years, the answer had been no. And the only reason it eventually changed wasn't because God had a sudden change of heart about Black people. It was because in 1978, the church had finally issued what they called a revelation. I needed to know more about that revelation. I needed to understand how the church had justified this for so long and why they had suddenly changed course. I needed to know if there had been an apology, an acknowledgement, anything. The next morning, I called in sick to the Family Search Center. I hadn't taken a sick day in 3 years, but I couldn't face those databases. Not yet. Not until I understood what they had been hiding from me all along. I fixed myself a glass of water and sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop. Outside, the sun was just coming up over the Wasatch Mountains, painting the snow-capped peaks pink and gold. It was beautiful. It had always been beautiful. But that morning, it looked different somehow. Like I was seeing it for the first time, without the filter of everything I thought I knew. I went looking for the words of the prophets. Have you ever had a moment where your whole world shifted? Tell me in the comments. What I found was worse than I expected. The Gospel Topics essay had been sanitized, careful, written by committee. But the original sources, the Journal of Discourses, the conference talks, the letters and diaries of early church leaders, those told a different story. Brigham Young hadn't been ambiguous. In 1852, he had declared to the Utah Territorial Legislature that any man having one drop of the seed of Cain in him cannot hold the priesthood. He had taught that Black people were cursed, that they were meant to be servants, that intermarriage between races was punishable by death. I found Brigham Young's actual words that night. I wish I hadn't. Shall I tell you the law of God in regard to the African race? If the white man who belongs to the chosen seed mixes his blood with the seed of Cain, the penalty, under the law of God, is death on the spot. This will always be so. This wasn't ancient history from some other religion. This was 1863. This was a prophet of God, speaking in general conference, the same conference I had watched every 6 months since I was a child, taking notes in my scripture journal, hanging on every word as revelation from the Lord. And these teachings hadn't been quietly abandoned. They had been repeated, expanded, defended by prophet after prophet for over 100 years. I thought about all the times I had stood in fast and testimony meeting, the first Sunday of each month after fasting for 24 hours, and declared that I knew the prophets were called of God, that they spoke for Him, that they would never lead the church astray. Those exact words from Official Declaration 1, which I had read dozens of times. If that was true, then God had wanted Black people excluded from heaven until 1978. And if that wasn't true, if the prophets had been wrong, had been speaking as men, had been influenced by the racism of their time, then how could I trust anything else they said? I pulled out Eloise Williams's journal and began to read. Her handwriting was cramped but careful. She wrote about her conversion with such joy that it made my chest ache. Today we became members of the true church, she wrote on March 15, 1952. The missionaries say we can be together forever. Thomas and I, and our babies, forever. I never knew such a thing was possible. 6 months later, another entry. Sister Johnson says we cannot go to the temple yet. She says there is a rule. I asked Elder Cummings about it, and he looked so sad. He says to be patient, that the Lord works in mysterious ways. I am trying to have faith. A year after that. I don't understand why we can't be sealed. Thomas is a good man. He pays tithing even when we can barely afford groceries. He gave up his tobacco the day the missionaries taught us the word of wisdom. Just threw the whole pouch in the trash and never looked back. He hasn't touched a drop of liquor since his baptism. He does everything they ask. He would make a fine deacon, a fine elder, a fine home teacher, but still no priesthood, still no temple, still no forever. And then, in 1965, 13 years after her baptism, I dreamed about the temple again last night. The white building, the golden angel Moroni on top, blowing his trumpet to announce the gospel to the world. In my dream, I walked inside, and no one stopped me. I wore the white dress I've been saving, the one I keep wrapped in tissue paper in my closet. I woke up crying. Thomas held me and said nothing. What is there to say? I was crying too, sitting at my kitchen table with her journal in my hands. This woman had given everything to the church. She had believed its promises. She had followed every commandment, kept every covenant she was allowed to make. And the church had looked at her faith, her devotion, her good and righteous heart, and said, "Not you, never you. Because of something you cannot control, something you were born with, you do not deserve eternity." The tools I had used for 25 years to connect families eternally were the same tools that now showed me exactly which families the church had rejected. The databases didn't lie. The records were meticulous, and they documented in precise detail decades of exclusion based on nothing but race. Gerald found me still at the kitchen table when he came home from work that evening. He was still wearing his white shirt and tie from his job at church headquarters. He worked in the correlation department, reviewing curriculum materials for doctrinal accuracy. The irony of that would hit me later. "Maggie, you've been here all day? Sister Thompson said you called in sick." I looked up at him. My husband of 32 years, my companion for eternity. We had been sealed in the Salt Lake Temple in 1993, surrounded by family and friends, dressed in white, making promises that would last beyond death. We had held hands across the altar, looking into those mirrors that reflected into infinity, symbolizing our eternal union. Eloise Williams had wanted that. She had been denied it for 26 years. "Gerald," I said, "did you know about the priesthood ban?" He set his briefcase down slowly. "The what?" "The ban on black members until 1978. "Oh." He loosened his tie, the way he always did when he came home, hanging it over the back of the kitchen chair. Yes, I knew there was something. A long time ago. But it's all fixed now, isn't it? President Kimball received the revelation. Fixed? The revelation. In 1978. President Kimball took it to the Lord in the temple, and the Lord told him that all worthy males could hold the priesthood. It was a wonderful day. I remember my parents talking about it. My father cried during the announcement at conference. He said it was one of the most spiritual moments of his life. I stared at him. And before that? Before that, things were different. But the Lord reveals things in his own time, Maggie. Line upon line, precept upon precept. We don't always understand his purposes. His purposes included telling black people they couldn't go to heaven? Gerald's expression shifted. Careful, guarded. The same expression he wore when investigators on his mission asked difficult questions. That's not exactly what. It is exactly what. I've spent all day reading the actual documents, Gerald. The prophets taught that black people were cursed, that they were less valiant in the pre-existence. That's why they couldn't receive temple ordinances. They weren't just banned from holding priesthood. They couldn't be deacons at 12 like our boys were, couldn't bless or pass the sacrament, couldn't baptize their own children. And they were banned from the celestial kingdom. They were banned from eternal families. Do you understand what that means? The whole plan of salvation, everything we teach, everything we believe. And they were excluded from it. Maggie, I think you're getting a little worked up about something that happened a long time ago. My client's grandmother converted in 1952. She believed in eternal families. She wanted to be sealed to her husband and children. and she died in 1984, 6 years after the ban was lifted. She waited 32 years for a promise that should have been hers from the beginning. 32 years of paying tithing. 32 years of keeping the word of wisdom. No tea, no coffee, no alcohol, no tobacco, everything the missionaries asked. 32 years of faithful church attendance, of magnifying her calling, of doing everything we ask of members. And she was told she wasn't good enough because of the color of her skin. Gerald sat down across from me. Did she eventually get sealed? Yes, in 1979, a few months after the revelation. Then it all worked out. The Lord's timing is not our timing. We have to trust what? Trust that God was racist until 1978? Trust that Brigham Young was speaking for the Lord when he said interracial marriage should be punished by death on the spot? Those are his exact words, Gerald. I can show you the citation. Prophets are men. They make mistakes. But the gospel is still true. If prophets can be that wrong about something that important for that long, how do we know what else they're wrong about? How do I know President Nelson is speaking for God and not just saying what he thinks? What about the temple changes? What about the policy on children of gay parents that got reversed? What about Maggie? Gerald reached across the table and took my hand. His grip was firm but gentle, the same hands that had blessed our children when they were sick, that had passed the sacrament every Sunday for 40 years. I think you need to pray about this. Fast and pray. Go to the temple. The answers will come. I looked at our joined hands. Mine were shaking again. I need to keep researching, I said quietly. I need to understand what happened and why. I owe that to Darren. I owe it to his grandmother. Gerald nodded slowly. Just don't lose yourself in this, okay? Remember your testimony. Remember what you know. The church is still true, even if there were mistakes in the past. The gospel is still true. The Book of Mormon is still true. The temple is still true. I didn't answer. I wasn't sure what I believed anymore. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed next to Gerald, listening to his even breathing, and stared at the ceiling. On my nightstand sat my scriptures, the quad I'd had since my mission, worn soft with use, filled with highlighted passages and notes in the margins. Next to them was my temple recommend, the small piece of paper that declared me worthy to enter the house of the Lord. I had answered those questions so many times. Do you sustain the president of the church as the prophet, seer, and revelator? Do you sustain the other general authorities and local leaders? Do you believe that the church has the authority to administer the ordinances of salvation? For over 100 years, those ordinances of salvation had been denied to Black members, not because of worthiness, not because of faith, because prophets, seers, and revelators had taught that their skin color made them unworthy of heaven. I got out of bed at 3 a.m. and went back to my laptop. I had more research to do. The next 3 days blurred together. I called in sick again, and then again, until Sister Thompson from the Family Search Center left a concerned voicemail asking if I needed a priesthood blessing. Gerald watched me with worried eyes across the dinner table, but I couldn't explain what I was doing. I wasn't sure I understood it myself. I had become an investigator again, not of the church, but of its history. And the more I dug, the more I found. The priesthood ban hadn't started with some ambiguous policy lost to time. It had a clear origin, a clear justification, and a clear paper trail. Brigham Young had instituted it formally in 1852, the same year he became governor of the Utah Territory. He had stood before the territorial legislature and declared that Black people were descended from Cain, that they bore a curse, and that this curse prevented them from holding the priesthood until every other descendant of Adam had received it first. I found the original speech in the Journal of Discourses. I read it 5 times, hoping I had misunderstood. I hadn't. The Lord told Cain that he should not receive the blessings of the priesthood nor his seed until the last of the posterity of Abel had received the priesthood, Brigham Young had taught. Until the curse is removed from them, they never can hold the priesthood. The last of the posterity of Abel. That meant until every white person on earth had received the priesthood first. The ban wasn't temporary in Brigham Young's mind. It was designed to last essentially forever. But it wasn't just Brigham Young. As I dug deeper, I found statement after statement from subsequent prophets, each one reinforcing and expanding the doctrine. John Taylor, third president of the church, taught in 1881 that the curse was not yet taken off the sons of Cain. Wilford Woodruff, fourth president, said in 1889 that black people cannot bear rule in the priesthood. Joseph Fielding Smith, who would later become the 10th president, wrote in 1931 that not only was Cain called upon to suffer, but because of his wickedness, he became the father of an inferior race. An inferior race. A prophet of God had called black people an inferior race. I sat back from my laptop and stared at the wall. My pioneer ancestors looked back at me from framed photographs, the Sorensens from Denmark, the Hansens from Sweden, the Petersons from Norway. They had crossed the ocean and then the plains, pulling handcarts through snow and wind, burying children along the trail, all for the promise of Zion. They had believed. They had sacrificed everything, and they had built a church that told black people they couldn't go to heaven. I thought about all the times I had defended the church to my non-member friends. We're not racist, I would say. We have members all over the world. We believe everyone is a child of God. I had believed it. I had believed it completely, but I had believed a version of the story that left out the most important parts. I had one question left, and I knew where to find the answer. The question was simple. Why had the ban ended? What had happened in 1978 that hadn't happened in 1958 or 1938 or 1918? If this was truly a doctrine from God, what had changed in the heavens that made black people suddenly worthy of eternity? I started researching the context of 1978. The civil rights movement had transformed America in the 60s and 70s. The church had faced increasing criticism for its racial policies. Universities had protested against BYU athletics. The NYACP had called for investigations. Politicians had questioned whether the church should maintain its tax-exempt status while practicing discrimination. And then there was Brazil. I found article after article about the São Paulo, Brazil temple, announced in 1975 and scheduled to open in 1978. Brazil was different from the United States. Centuries of intermarriage had made it nearly impossible to determine who had African ancestry and who didn't. The church faced an impossible situation. How could they determine which Brazilian members were pure enough to enter the temple? They couldn't. The racial categories that had seemed so clear in Utah dissolved in the complexity of Brazilian history. The pressure was mounting from every direction. External pressure from the civil rights movement and the government. Internal pressure from members who couldn't understand why their black brothers and sisters were excluded. Practical pressure from Brazil, where the church was growing rapidly but couldn't function under its own racial rules. And then, on June 8, 1978, Official Declaration 2 was announced. I read the declaration carefully. It was short, just a few paragraphs. President Spencer W. Kimball had spent many hours in the upper room of the temple supplicating the Lord for divine guidance. He had received a revelation extending priesthood and temple blessings to all worthy male members of the church. The first presidency and the quorum of the 12 apostles had sustained the revelation unanimously. No apology, no acknowledgement of past wrongdoing, no explanation of why God had suddenly changed his mind. Just a revelation. Announced 3 months before the São Paulo temple was scheduled to open, the timing was remarkable. For 126 years, prophets had taught that the curse of Cain would last until the end of the millennium. Then, precisely when the church needed the doctrine to change for practical reasons, God conveniently sent a revelation. I wanted to believe it was genuine. I wanted to believe that Spencer W. Kimball had truly communed with heaven and received new light and knowledge. But the more I researched, the harder that became. I found interviews with apostles who had been in the room that day. Some described a profound spiritual experience. Others were more measured. Elder Bruce R. McConkie, who had previously taught the ban was eternal doctrine, later admitted that they had all been wrong. Forget everything that I have said, or what President Brigham Young or President George Q. Cannon or whomsoever has said in days past that is contrary to the present revelation, he said in 1978. We spoke with a limited understanding. A limited understanding. 126 years of excluding people from heaven because of limited understanding. I thought about Eloise Williams writing in her journal, praying for the day she could enter the temple. She had died in 1984, 6 years after the ban was lifted. She had finally been sealed to Thomas in 1979. But she had spent 26 years, the majority of her membership, being told she wasn't good enough. How do you apologize for that? How do you make that right? The answer, apparently, was that you didn't. The church had never issued a formal apology for the priesthood ban. The 2013 Gospel Topics essay acknowledged that the ban was wrong, that the theories used to justify it were rejected, but it stopped short of saying, "We're sorry." Disavowing theories wasn't the same as apologizing to the people who had been hurt by them. I needed to talk to someone, not Gerald. He had made his position clear, not my bishop. I wasn't ready for that conversation. I needed someone who understood what I was going through, someone who had walked this path before. I found the Mormon Stories podcast almost by accident. A search for priesthood ban testimonies led me to an episode featuring Black former members sharing their experiences. I put in my earbuds and pressed play. The stories were devastating. A woman who had converted in 1965 told by her bishop that she could be baptized but never sealed to her husband. A man who had grown up in the church, watching his white friends receive the priesthood at 12 while he stood on the sidelines. A family who had waited for decades, then finally entered the temple in 1979, only to discover that the damage had already been done. Their children had stopped believing. The church took something from me that I can never get back, one woman said through tears. They took my faith in a God who loved me equally. They took my trust in prophets. They took decades of my life waiting for a promise that should have been mine from the beginning. I paused the podcast and sat in silence. This was what I had been complicit in. Not directly. I had been born after the ban ended, but I had spent 25 years working for an institution that had done this. I had helped people trace their genealogy, find their ancestors, prepare names for temple work. And I had never once asked why some families had gaps in their records. I had never once questioned why certain names had no ordinances before 1978. The databases I loved so much, the ones I had believed were sacred tools for connecting families eternally, they had been tracking who was excluded as much as who was included. I thought about Darren Williams, sitting in my office with his grandmother's journal, asking if she had gotten what she wanted. He was going to come back for an update. He was going to ask what I had found. What was I going to tell him? The truth. I was going to tell him the truth. But first, I needed to understand one more thing. I needed to know how the church talked about this now. Were they honest about the history? Did they acknowledge the harm? Or did they minimize and deflect the way Gerald had? I went to the church's official website and searched for everything I could find about race and the priesthood. The Gospel Topics essay was still there, carefully worded and heavily footnoted. It acknowledged that the church disavows the theories advanced in the past about racial inferiority and the curse of Cain. But it also said, we do not know why God had instituted the ban in the first place. We do not know. After everything I had read, the speeches by Brigham Young, the teachings of subsequent prophets, the explicit doctrines about the curse of Cain and the pre-existence, the official position was, we do not know? I knew. The historical record was clear. The ban existed because 19th century leaders held racist beliefs that were common in their time, and they taught those beliefs as doctrine. There was no mystery. There was no divine purpose that couldn't be understood. There was simply racism, dressed up in religious language and maintained for over a century because no one had the courage to admit the prophets were wrong, but the church couldn't say that. If they admitted that prophets had taught racism as doctrine for 126 years, it would undermine the entire foundation of prophetic authority. If Brigham Young could be that wrong about something that important, what else could the prophets be wrong about? The answer, I was beginning to realize, was a lot of things. I spent the next evening going down what longtime members called the rabbit hole. The priesthood ban was just the beginning. There were the multiple accounts of the first vision, each one different, the earliest not written until 12 years after it supposedly happened. There were the Book of Mormon anachronisms, horses and steel and wheat in pre-Columbian America. There was the Book of Abraham, supposedly translated from ancient Egyptian papyri, which modern Egyptologists said had nothing to do with Abraham at all. There was polygamy, not just the fact of it, but the details I had never heard. Joseph Smith marrying teenage girls. Joseph Smith marrying women who were already married to other men. Brigham Young threatening to kill men who refused to give him their wives. There was the Mountain Meadows Massacre, where Mormon militiamen slaughtered over 100 immigrants traveling through Utah, then blamed it on Native Americans for decades. There were the temple ceremonies, which had changed repeatedly over the years. The penalties of graphic death oaths removed in 1990. The requirement that women covenant to obey their husbands changed in 2019. If the temple was an eternal, unchanging ordinance revealed by God, why did it keep changing? Want to help more people hear these stories? Check the description for how to support. Each new piece of information connected to others, forming a web of doubt that grew larger with every passing hour. I felt like I was standing in a house I had lived in my whole life, only to discover that the walls were cardboard, the foundation was sand, and the roof had been leaking for years without anyone telling me. And yet, I had felt the spirit in that house. I had felt it bearing witness of the Book of Mormon. I had felt it in the temple. I had felt it when I blessed my children and when I served in my callings, and when I bore my testimony in fast and testimony meeting. Had all of that been a lie? Had I been deceived? Or was there something real underneath all the broken pieces, something worth salvaging? I didn't know anymore. On Saturday morning, a week after I had first found the Williams family records, Gerald sat down across from me at the kitchen table. He had the look he always got before important conversations, the stake president look, even though he'd been released from that calling 3 years ago. "Maggie," he said, "we need to talk about what's happening." "I know. You've barely eaten, you haven't slept, you've missed a week of work. Sister Thompson is beside herself. She thinks you're dying." "I'm not dying." "Then what is it? What did you find that's doing this to you?" I looked at my husband. 32 years, 4 children, 11 grandchildren. A lifetime of shared faith, shared covenants, shared assumptions about the nature of God and the universe and our place in it. "I found out the church isn't what we thought it was," I said. "I found out the prophets have been wrong about things. Big things. Important things. For a long time." Gerald was quiet for a moment. "The priesthood ban? That's where it started. But it's not just that. It's everything. The history we were never taught. The doctrines that keep changing. The things they tell us are eternal that turn out to be temporary." I took a breath. "I don't know if I believe anymore, Gerald. I don't know if any of it is true." I expected anger. I expected him to quote scripture at me, to remind me of my covenants, to bear his testimony with the force of someone trying to save a drowning person. That's what I would have done, a week ago, if our positions had been reversed. Instead, Gerald reached across the table and took my hand. "I know," he said quietly. "You know? I've known for years, Maggie. About the history. About the problems. I work in correlation, remember? I've seen the documents we choose not to include in the manuals. I've read the footnotes that explain away the difficult parts. I know what we don't teach." I stared at him. "Then how can you still believe?" "Because belief is a choice." He squeezed my hand. "I know the church isn't perfect. I know the prophets have made mistakes. But I also know that this is where I belong. This is my community, my family, my heritage. The church has given me purpose and structure and a framework for understanding the world. I'm not willing to give that up just because Brigham Young was a racist. It's not just racism, Gerald. It's the whole foundation. If the prophets can be that wrong, then they're human, like the rest of us." He paused. "I've made my peace with a messy church, Maggie. I can hold the contradictions. The question is whether you can." I pulled my hand back. "I don't know if I want to make peace with it. I don't know if I should. There are people who were hurt by these teachings. Real people. Eloise Williams waited 26 years for a promise that should have been hers immediately. And the church has never even apologized. What would an apology change? It would mean they acknowledged the harm. It would mean they took responsibility. It would mean... I stopped, because I realized what I was really saying. It would mean I could trust them again. Gerald nodded slowly. And without that? Without that, I don't know if I can. We sat in silence for a long time. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, catching the dust motes suspended in the air. On the refrigerator, photos of our children and grandchildren smiled at us. Temple marriages, mission farewells, baptisms, a lifetime of faith, documented in glossy prints. I need to call Darren, I finally said. He's coming in on Monday for his update. He needs to know what I found. Gerald nodded. What are you going to tell him? The truth. About his grandmother. About why she waited so long. About what the church taught and why they changed. I paused. He deserves to know. And then what? I looked at the stack of research on the table, the printouts, the notes, the journal that still sat where Darren had left it weeks ago, the evidence of my unraveling. I don't know, I admitted. I honestly don't know. Darren arrived at my office on Monday afternoon, right on time. He was wearing a blue blazer and carrying a notebook, as if he expected to take notes on whatever I told him, as if the answer might be simple. I had spent the weekend preparing for this conversation. I had organized my research into a folder. Not everything, just the parts that related directly to his grandmother. The Gospel Topics essay, the timeline of the priesthood ban, the relevant quotes from prophets, the date of official declaration too. I had even found the record of Eloise and Thomas's sealing in 1979, 27 years after their baptism, performed in the Washington, D.C. temple, just 9 months after the ban was lifted. I had also spent the weekend wrestling with what to say and how to say it. This wasn't just genealogical research anymore. This was a conversation about faith, about racism, about institutions and the harm they cause. Darren wasn't a member of the church. He had no investment in protecting it. But Eloise had been, and this was her story, and I owed it to her memory to tell it honestly. Mrs. Sorensen, Darren said, settling into the chair across from my desk. You look tired. Everything okay? It's been a long week, I admitted. I found what you were looking for. But I need to warn you. It's not a simple answer. His expression shifted, became more serious. Tell me. I took a breath. Your grandmother converted to the church in 1952. She was faithful her entire life. She kept every commandment, attended every meeting, paid her tithing, lived the word of wisdom. She did everything she was supposed to do. But she couldn't go to the temple until 1979. None of your family could. Not your grandfather, not your father, not your aunts and uncles. For 27 years, they were members of the church but excluded from the highest ordinances. Darren frowned. Why? This was the moment. The moment where I either told him the sanitized version, there was a policy that changed, or the truth. I chose the truth. Because they were black, I said. From 1852 until 1978, the church banned black members from holding the priesthood and receiving temple ordinances. Your grandmother couldn't be sealed to your grandfather. Your father couldn't be baptized for the dead or receive his endowment. They were told that because of their race, they weren't eligible for the highest blessings of the gospel. Darren was silent for a long moment. His hands were still on the notebook, but he wasn't writing anything. The church taught this? He finally asked. Officially? Officially, from the prophet down. They taught that black people bore the curse of Cain, that because of something that happened in the Bible, black people were marked and couldn't hold the priesthood. They taught that black people had been less valiant in the pre-existence before they were born, and that's why they were born with dark skin. I paused. These weren't fringe beliefs. These were doctrines taught by prophets in general conference. And my grandmother knew this? She knew she couldn't go to the temple. I don't know how much of the theology she was told, but she wrote about it in her journal. I pulled out the worn leather book Darren had left with me. She wrote about wanting to be sealed, about not understanding why she couldn't, about dreaming of the temple and waking up crying. I opened to a page I had marked. "May I read you something?" Darren nodded. This is from 1962, 10 years after her baptism. She wrote, "Today in Relief Society, Sister Patterson talked about eternal families, how we can be together forever if we go to the temple." The other sisters were nodding and smiling. I wanted to raise my hand and ask why I can't have that too. But I already know the answer. The answer is that I am not worthy in the same way they are. The answer is that God sees something in me that makes me less. I don't know what I did wrong. I have prayed and no answer comes. Thomas says we must have faith. But faith in what? A God who loves some of his children more than others? My voice cracked on the last sentence. I had read this passage a dozen times, and it still broke me. Darren took the journal from my hands. He stared at his grandmother's handwriting for a long time. "She thought it was her fault," he said quietly. "She thought she had done something wrong." That's what the doctrine implied. That black people had been less valiant before they were born, and this life was a consequence of that. It put the blame on the victim. And then in 1978, God just changed his mind? That's the official position. President Spencer W. Kimball received a revelation that all worthy males could hold the priesthood. The ban was lifted. Your grandmother and grandfather were sealed in 1979. Just like that. Just like that. After 126 years. Darren closed the journal. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. "She never told us any of this. My father never talked about it. I knew they were Mormon, or had been when I was young, but they left the church when I was about 10. I always assumed it was just, they drifted away, like people do." "Do you want to know why they left?" He nodded. I pulled out another document, a family group sheet I had compiled from the records. Your father, Thomas Jr., was baptized at 12 in 1952. He was a member for 27 years before he could receive the priesthood. In 1979, after the ban was lifted, he would have been 39 years old. His white friends had been elders and high priests for decades. They had blessed their children, baptized their grandchildren, served in bishoprics and stake presidencies. Your father had been waiting. And then what? He received the priesthood in 1979. He and your mother were sealed. But according to the records, they stopped attending church sometime in the early 1980s. Their names are still on the membership rolls, but there's no activity after 1983. The year my grandmother died. Yes. Darren was quiet again. I watched him process what I had told him. The weight of it, the implications. His grandmother had been faithful unto death, even after everything the church had done to her. But his father had not been able to carry that burden. "Did the church ever apologize?" he asked. "No." They issued an essay in 2013 that acknowledged the ban was wrong and that the theories behind it are rejected. But there has never been a formal apology. Why not? I had asked myself the same question 100 times over the past week. I think because an apology would require admitting that prophets taught false doctrine for over a century. And if they admit that, it raises questions about what else the prophets might be wrong about. The whole structure of the church is built on the idea that the prophet speaks for God. If Brigham Young was speaking for himself when he instituted the ban, then maybe other prophets have been speaking for themselves too. So they protect the institution instead of acknowledging the harm. That's how it looks to me. Though I'm sure they would say they're protecting the faith of the members. That dwelling on past mistakes doesn't help anyone move forward. Darren shook his head slowly. Tell that to my grandmother. Tell that to all the people who were told they weren't good enough for heaven because of the color of their skin. I didn't have an answer for that. I had been wrestling with the same anger, the same grief, the same sense of betrayal. And I was white. I had never been personally affected by the ban. I could only imagine what it felt like to discover this history from the inside. "What are you going to do with this information?" I asked. Darren looked at the journal in his hands. "I'm going to tell my family. My father is still alive. He's 84, lives in Atlanta. I don't know if he'll want to talk about it, but I think he needs to know that I know, that someone finally asked the questions. Will you go back to the church? He laughed, a short, bitter sound. No, I was never a member anyway. But even if I had been... He shook his head. An institution that took 126 years to decide Black people were fully human? That's not somewhere I belong. I nodded. I understood. More than he knew I understood. Mrs. Sorensen, Darren said, can I ask you something personal? Of course. You've been a member your whole life. You work here at the Genealogy Center. This is your world. He paused. How are you handling all of this? The question hit me harder than I expected. No one had asked me that. Not Gerald, not Sister Thompson, not anyone. They had all assumed I was struggling, but no one had asked how I was actually doing. I'm not sure I am handling it, I admitted. A week ago, I was a faithful Latter-day Saint with a temple recommend and a testimony. Now I'm not sure what I am. I've spent 25 years helping people connect their families, believing it was sacred work. But now I know that the same church that told me families are forever told your grandmother that her family wasn't worthy of forever. How do I reconcile that? Maybe you don't. What do you mean? Darren leaned forward. Maybe some things can't be reconciled. Maybe some contradictions are too big to hold together. My grandmother spent her whole life trying to make sense of a church that told her she was cursed. She died still believing, still hoping, still waiting for answers that never came. Maybe the answer is that there is no answer. The church was wrong, the prophets were wrong, and no amount of faith or patience or mental gymnastics can make that okay. The world rearranged itself around my new understanding. I had spent the past week trying to find a way to hold it all together. The good and the bad, the spiritual experiences, and the historical horrors. I had been looking for a synthesis, a way to say the church is flawed but still true. But what if there was no synthesis? What if some things were just broken? I don't know if I can leave, I said. This is everything I know. My family, my community, my entire identity is wrapped up in the church. I understand, but you don't have to decide today, do you? No, I suppose not. Darren stood and extended his hand. Thank you for telling me the truth. I know it wasn't easy, and I'm sorry this has cost you so much. I shook his hand. I'm sorry too. I'm sorry your grandmother lived her whole life under that shadow. She deserved better. She did. He tucked the journal under his arm. We all do. After Darren left, I sat at my desk for a long time. The family search databases glowed on my screen, waiting for me to input more names, find more connections, link more families to eternity. I had done this work for 25 years. It had given my life meaning and purpose. But now, every time I looked at those records, I saw the gaps. The families who had been excluded, the ordinances that had been denied, the people who had been told they weren't worthy of heaven. How could I keep doing this work? How could I stop? I thought about my own family, my children, my grandchildren, all sealed in the temple, all promised eternity together. That promise had meant everything to me. It had carried me through miscarriages and deaths and dark nights of the soul. The belief that we would be together forever had been the foundation of everything. But it was the same promise that had been dangled in front of Eloise Williams for 27 years, always just out of reach. The same promise that had been used as a weapon, a way to tell Black families that they weren't good enough for God's highest blessings. What's the hardest thing you've ever had to unlearn? Tell me. I had to unlearn the belief that my church was uniquely true, that the prophets spoke directly for God, that the institution I had given my life to was worthy of that devotion. I didn't know what would take its place. I didn't know if anything could. That evening, I drove past the temple on my way home. The Salt Lake Temple was under renovation, wrapped in scaffolding, but the angel Moroni still stood on top, golden trumpet raised to the sky. I had seen that image thousands of times. It had always filled me with peace. Now it just made me sad. I thought about all the people who had stood outside those walls, waiting for permission to enter. The Black families before 1978. The LGBTQ members whose sealings had been nullified when they came out. The women who couldn't hold the priesthood, couldn't bless their own children, couldn't lead without a man's permission. The temple was supposed to be a house of God, open to all his children. But it had always had gatekeepers. It had always had rules about who was worthy and who wasn't. And those rules had caused immeasurable harm. I parked in my driveway but didn't go inside right away. Gerald would be there, with his nuanced faith and his ability to hold contradictions. Our children would call eventually, asking why I had missed church the past 2 Sundays. My bishop would want to meet with me. The whole machinery of Mormon community would start turning, trying to bring me back into the fold. I wasn't sure I wanted to be brought back. For the first time in 58 years, I let myself imagine a life outside the church. No more temple recommend interviews. No more tithing settlement. No more Sundays spent in meetings from 9 to noon. No more garments under my clothes. No more word of wisdom restrictions. No more measuring my worthiness against an ever-shifting standard. It was terrifying. And also, strangely, liberating. I didn't have to decide tonight. Darren was right about that. But I knew, sitting in my car as the sun set behind the mountains, that something fundamental had shifted. The door I had opened couldn't be closed again. The questions I had asked couldn't be unasked. I was going to have to rebuild my life on a new foundation. I just didn't know yet what that foundation would be. I went inside. Gerald was in the kitchen, making dinner. Something simple, the way he always did when I was struggling. He looked up when I came in, and I saw the question in his eyes. How did it go with Darren? I told him everything. About his grandmother, about the ban, about why it took so long. How did he take it? About as well as you'd expect. I set my bag down on the counter. He's not going to join the church, obviously, but he seemed grateful for the truth. Gerald nodded. He didn't ask the other question, the one that hung between us like smoke. He didn't ask what I was going to do. Maybe he already knew that I didn't have an answer yet. Dinner's almost ready, he said instead. Soup and bread, nothing fancy. That sounds good. We ate in silence, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who had been married for 32 years, who knew each other well enough to know when words weren't needed. Gerald had made his peace with the church's flaws. I was still looking for mine. After dinner, I went to my office and sat down at my laptop. I had one more thing I needed to do. I opened a new document and began to write. To Eloise Williams, who I never met but feel I know, I am sorry. I am sorry that the church you loved told you that you weren't worthy of heaven. I am sorry that you spent 27 years waiting for a promise that should have been yours from the beginning. I am sorry that I spent 25 years helping build the systems that excluded you, without ever stopping to ask who was being left out. I can't change what happened. I can't give you back those years. But I can promise you this. I will not forget. I will not look away. I will tell your story to anyone who will listen, so that what was done to you and thousands of others will not be erased or minimized or explained away. You deserved better. You deserved a church that saw your worth from the first day. You deserved prophets who spoke truth instead of prejudice. You deserved to walk into that temple in 1952, the same year you were baptized, and receive every blessing that was given to your white brothers and sisters. I am sorry you didn't get that. I am sorry I can't give it to you now, but I can make sure your granddaughter knows who you were. I can make sure your story survives. That's all I have to offer. I hope it's enough. I saved the document and closed my laptop. Outside, the stars were coming out over the mountains, the same stars that Eloise Williams had looked up at 70 years ago, wondering why God had made her different, wondering if she would ever be good enough for heaven. She had been good enough. She had always been good enough. The church just hadn't been good enough to see it. 3 months later, I resigned from the Family Search Center. It wasn't a dramatic exit. No angry confrontations, no tearful goodbyes. I simply told Sister Thompson that I needed to take a different path, that my season of service there had come to an end. She hugged me and said she would pray for me, and I thanked her and meant it. She was a good woman. Most of them were good people. That was never the question. The question was whether I could keep building something I no longer believed in. Gerald supported my decision, even though I knew it confused him. He had found a way to stay, to hold the contradictions, as he put it, to take the good and leave the bad. For him, the church was like a family, flawed, sometimes deeply flawed, but still his home. He wasn't going to leave over historical problems any more than he would disown a relative who had done something terrible. I understood his position. I just couldn't share it anymore. The people I had spent 25 years connecting to eternity, some of them had been told they didn't deserve to be there. That knowledge had changed everything. Every time I looked at a temple record, I saw the gaps. Every time I helped someone trace their pioneer ancestry, I wondered about the families who had been excluded from that heritage. Every time I entered data into the system, I felt like I was participating in something that had caused tremendous harm and never fully acknowledged it. So I left, quietly, without fanfare, but completely. The first Sunday I didn't go to church felt like stepping off a cliff. I woke up at the usual time, put on my usual dress, and then sat on the edge of my bed, unable to move. Gerald got ready and kissed me on the forehead before he left. "I'll be home after meetings," he said. "There's lunch in the fridge." "Thank you." "I love you, Maggie. Whatever you're going through, that hasn't changed." "I know. I love you too." After he left, I changed out of my church dress and into regular clothes. I made myself breakfast, something I never did on Sundays, because we were always rushing to get to our 9 o'clock meetings. I sat at the kitchen table and ate slowly, watching the sunlight move across the floor. I had nowhere to be. Nothing was expected of me. For the first time in 58 years, Sunday was just another day. It was disorienting. And also, surprisingly, peaceful. Over the following weeks, I began to build a new life. I still did genealogical research. It turned out I loved the work itself, even if I could no longer do it under the church's umbrella. I started my own small business, helping people trace their family histories without any religious agenda. I specialized in difficult cases, the ones that required digging through obscure records and making connections that others had missed. My first client was Darren Williams. He had gone back to Atlanta after our conversation and talked to his father. Thomas Jr. was 84 years old and had not spoken about the church in decades. But when Darren showed him his mother's journal, when he read him the passages about waiting for the temple, about dreaming of walking through those doors, Thomas Jr. had broken down and wept. He talked for 3 hours, Darren told me over the phone, things he had never told anyone. About what it was like to watch his white friends get ordained at 12 while he stood on the sidelines. About the bishops who told him to be patient, that the Lord would provide in his own time. About the day in 1978 when he finally received the priesthood, and how he thought he would feel joy, but instead felt rage at all the years that had been stolen from him. Is he okay? He's processing. I think he needed to tell that story. I think he's been carrying it for 50 years, and he finally had someone who would listen. I thought about all the stories like that. All the Black members who had lived through the ban, who had been told they were cursed, who had waited and waited for a God who supposedly loved them equally to finally acknowledge their worth. How many of them had ever been able to tell their stories? How many had died with that burden still on their shoulders? "I want to help him document it," Darren said. "His history, my grandmother's history, our whole family's experience with the church. Would you be willing to help?" "Of course." "Even though you're not part of the church anymore?" "Especially because I'm not part of the church anymore. I can tell the truth without worrying about protecting the institution." He asked me a question I couldn't answer. Not honestly. That question, "And you still believe?" had haunted me for months. Darren had asked it on behalf of his grandmother, but he was really asking it on behalf of everyone who had ever been hurt by the church and still tried to hold on to their faith. The honest answer was no. I didn't still believe. Not in the way I once had. Not in the way the church required. I didn't believe that Joseph Smith was a prophet who received golden plates from an angel. I didn't believe that the Book of Mormon was an ancient record of American peoples. I didn't believe that the temple ceremonies were eternal ordinances revealed from heaven. I didn't believe that the men in Salt Lake City spoke directly for God. But I also didn't believe that everything had been a lie. The spiritual experiences I'd had were real, even if I now understood them differently. The community that had sustained me through hard times had been genuine, even if it came with conditions I could no longer accept. The values I had learned, service, family, integrity, compassion, those were worth keeping, even if I was letting go of the theology that had supposedly produced them. I was finding my own way, building something new from the rubble of what had collapsed. This channel exists for people like us, the ones who chose truth over comfort. Subscribe if that's you. In April, 6 months after I had first found the Williams family records, I got a letter from Thomas Jr. It was handwritten, shaky but legible, and it arrived in a plain white envelope with an Atlanta return address. Dear Mrs. Sorensen, my son tells me you're the one who found my mother's journal entries, who told him the truth about why we couldn't go to the temple, who helped him understand what our family went through. I want to thank you. For 60 years, I carried that weight alone. My wife knew some of it, but I could never talk about it. Not really. It was too painful. Every time I thought about the church, I felt that old rage rise up in me. Rage at what they took from us. Rage at the years we spent being told we weren't good enough. Rage at the God I had been taught to worship who apparently thought I was cursed. When Darren showed me Mama's journal, I cried for the first time in decades. She wrote about dreaming of the temple. I dreamed of it too back then. I dreamed of walking through those doors and finally being worthy, finally being seen as an equal child of God. When the ban was lifted in 1978, I thought that dream would finally come true, but it didn't feel the way I expected. By then, I was 39 years old. I had spent my whole adult life being told I couldn't hold the priesthood. When they finally gave it to me, it felt like charity, like they were doing me a favor by treating me as human. I couldn't stomach it. I went to the temple once for my sealing and I never went back. My mother stayed faithful until the day she died. I don't know how she did it. Maybe she was stronger than me. Or maybe she just didn't know how to be anything else. The church was everything to her, her community, her identity, her hope. Even when it hurt her, she couldn't let it go. I let it go. I had to. But I never stopped wondering if I'd made the right choice. Your son tells me you've left the church too. That you couldn't keep believing after you learned what they did to us. I want you to know that means something to me. It means there are white members who are willing to see the truth, even when it costs them. Thank you for honoring my mother's memory. Thank you for telling her story. Thank you for not looking away. With gratitude, Thomas Williams Jr., I read that letter 12 times. Each time I found something new in it, a phrase that resonated, a sentiment that matched my own experience, a reminder of why I had made the choices I had made. Thomas Williams Jr. had carried his pain for 60 years. He had left the church to survive, but he had never fully healed. The wound was too deep, the betrayal too fundamental. How do you recover from being told by God's supposed representatives that you were born cursed? I thought about my own wound, so much smaller than his. I had only lost my faith. I hadn't lost decades of my life to a doctrine that said I was inferior. I hadn't watched my mother die, still hoping for a heaven that had been promised and then withheld. I hadn't grown up wondering what I had done wrong in a pre-existence I couldn't remember to deserve being born into a cursed body. My pain was real, but it was nothing compared to what the Williams family had endured. And yet, we were connected now. Bound together not by temple ordinances, but by truth. By the willingness to see clearly, even when it hurt. By the refusal to pretend that everything was fine when everything was broken. I wrote back to Thomas Jr. that same day. I told him about my own journey, my discovery, my research, my decision to leave. I told him that his mother's journal had changed my life, that her words had given me the courage to ask questions I had been afraid to ask. I told him that I would spend the rest of my life making sure stories like hers were not forgotten. And I told him I was sorry. Not on behalf of the church. I had no authority to apologize for them, and they hadn't asked me to. But on behalf of myself. For all the years I had participated in a system that had hurt people like his family. For all the times I had defended the church without knowing what I was defending. for all the ways I had been complicit in perpetuating harm. It wasn't enough. I knew it wasn't enough. Nothing could give Thomas Williams Jr. back the decades that had been stolen from him. Nothing could bring Eloise Williams back to life and hand her the temple ceiling she had wanted from the beginning. Nothing could undo the damage that had been done to countless Black families by a doctrine that should never have existed. But it was what I had to offer. An acknowledgement. A witness. A promise to remember. I still do the same work. But now I do it for everyone. That became my mission. Not a 2-year calling to knock on doors and share the gospel, but a lifetime commitment to finding truth and telling it. I helped families research their histories without agenda. I spoke at conferences about the importance of honest genealogy, of not sanitizing the past to make it more comfortable. I wrote articles about the hidden stories in church records, the gaps, the exclusions, the people who had been erased. And I kept telling Eloise Williams' story, to anyone who would listen, to researchers and historians and former members and questioning believers. Her journal entries became part of a larger project documenting the experiences of Black Latter-day Saints during the priesthood ban. Her voice joined a chorus of voices that had been silenced for too long. Gerald stayed in the church. We worked out an arrangement that honored both our choices. He attended meetings alone, I stayed home, and we didn't try to convince each other that we were right. Some of our children followed him, others followed me. Our grandchildren were being raised with varying levels of involvement, and we learned to love them all the same. It wasn't the eternal family I had imagined when I was young and faithful and certain, but it was real. It was honest. And maybe that was better than forever built on a foundation of lies. On the 1-year anniversary of finding the Williams family records, I drove up to the Salt Lake Temple. The renovation was still ongoing, the scaffolding still wrapped around the ancient walls. But I could see the angel Moroni on top, golden trumpet raised, announcing a gospel to the world. I sat in my car and looked at that building for a long time. I had been married there. My children had been sealed there. I had spent countless hours inside those walls, participating in ordinances I had believed were eternal and true. Now I saw it differently. I saw a beautiful building that had been used to exclude people. I saw a symbol of promises that had been made and broken. I saw an institution that had caused tremendous harm and never fully reckoned with its history. But I also saw something else. I saw the faith of people like Eloise Williams, who had believed despite everything. I saw the courage of people like Thomas Jr., who had walked away to save themselves. I saw the complexity of people like Gerald, who had found a way to stay without looking away. I saw my own story, intertwined with all of theirs. I wasn't angry anymore. The rage had burned through me and left something quieter in its place. A sadness, maybe, but also a kind of peace. I couldn't change the past. I couldn't make the church apologize. I couldn't give back what had been taken from so many people. But I could tell the truth. I could honor the memory of those who had been hurt. I could build something new on the ashes of what had burned down. I started my car and drove home. Gerald would be there, making dinner, waiting to hear about my day. We would eat together and talk about ordinary things, the grandchildren, the garden, the news. We would go to bed in the same room, sealed together by a ceremony I no longer believed in, but bound by something stronger. 32 years of shared life, of love that had survived the worst crisis either of us had ever faced. I had lost my faith. But I had found something else. I had found the courage to look at uncomfortable truths. I had found the freedom to ask questions without fear. I had found a community of people who were rebuilding their lives just like me. And I had found Eloise Williams, a woman I had never met, whose journal had cracked open my world and let the light in. Before you go, this was fiction. Inspired by truth, but fiction. Names, places, details, all created to protect real people. The historical and doctrinal information comes from public sources. Links are below. Thank you for listening with an open heart. The priesthood ban was real. The suffering was real. The lack of apology is real. But the characters in this story are composites, imagined from the countless testimonies of people who lived through this history and are still processing its impact today. If you're questioning your faith, you're not alone. If you've left a religion that hurt you, you're not alone. If you're trying to find a way to stay in a flawed institution, you're not alone. We're all just trying to find our way home. I want to end by being completely transparent. This is a fictional story inspired by real testimonies. No real person is depicted here. The goal isn't to harm anyone. It's to represent an experience that millions have lived. All church-related facts are sourced in the description. What's the hardest thing you've ever had to unlearn? Tell me. Whatever it was, I hope you found your way through. I hope you found people who understood. I hope you found the truth, even when it cost you everything you thought you knew. That's what Eloise Williams wanted. That's what Thomas Jr. wanted. That's what I wanted. The truth. Even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts. Because the only way out is through.